Once you've gotten the feel for navigating the timeline using ActionScript, you're ready to move on and begin to make use of frame labels. A frame label is a way of giving a casual nickname to a specific keyframe along the timeline. This way, instead of using frame numbers such as 1, 20, 50, and so on, we can refer to frames by their name, for instance start, midpoint, beginning, and so on. This provides an easier method of navigating these frames using ActionScript, and since frame labels can move with keyframes, it gives us a lot of flexibility if something on the timeline changes, for instance the position of an animation or the starting or ending point. Let's go ahead and set up a new layer where we can add some frame labels. Very much like Actions, it's usually recommended that you set up a dedicated layer for frame labels, although it's not necessary. Again, it's just considered a best practice, and organizationally you may find it's just a little bit easier. To get started, first make sure that you have the rccar4.fla file open. You can find that in this lesson's folder. And go ahead and move down and click on the new layer icon below the timeline. This is going to add a new empty layer on the timeline, and let's go ahead and double-click the title and rename this Labels. Again, Labels is an arbitrary name, but it makes sense since this is the layer that we're going to add frame labels to. Also, depending on where your new layer ended up, you want to make sure you move this below the Actions layer. You can simply click and drag that and make sure that it sits below the Actions layer and above the Buttons layer if it doesn't already. For any keyframe, we can assign it a frame label. To do this, we actually select the keyframe. So let's go ahead and click on Keyframe 1 on our new Labels layer. And let's go over to the Properties panel. You'll see this shows us options or properties for our frame, including a label category. Locate the name type-in field underneath label and click inside there. Here we can type in and assign a new frame label to this specific keyframe. Since this is the beginning of our timeline, let's go ahead and give this the name of Start and hit Enter or Return. As soon as you do, take a look at your labels layer on the timeline, and you'll see the label appears next to the keyframe, and on the keyframe itself we see a small flag icon. This lets us know that a frame label has been assigned to this specific keyframe. From this point on, we can refer to frame 1 as Start. This is especially handy if we're navigating the timeline using ActionScript. Now that we've assigned a frame label to keyframe 1, let's see how we can actually put this into use within our ActionScript. If you remember earlier, on frame 70, we created a go to and play action, which sent our timeline in a loop. Let's go ahead and select keyframe 70 on the Actions layer, and let's go up to Window and choose Actions to open up the Actions panel. We should see a script there that reads go to and play and the number 1 inside of parentheses. Now instead of using the number 1, since keyframe 1 features a frame label by the name of Start, we can use this in its place. Go ahead and move your cursor inside the parentheses and delete or backspace and get rid of that number 1. And inside of double quotes, go ahead and type the name of our new frame label, which is Start. Now you'll notice two things here, which is first of all, I made sure to enter my frame label inside of double quotes. Since this is free-form text and it's not something that's part of the language, I always want to make sure to distinguish it by putting it inside of double quotes. Secondly, you'll notice that I use the exact same casing structure with a capital S. You want to make sure that these are consistent so that everything works the way it should. So now our complete line should read go to and play and then the word Start in double quotes. Let's go ahead, we can leave our Actions panel open and test our movie and see how our actions behave now that we're using a frame label instead. Go up to Control and choose Test Movie. So we'll see our movie plays back exactly the same way as we would expect. So it didn't matter that we used a frame number or a frame label. We were actually able to interchange the two. The advantage to using the frame label, of course, will become apparent in the next couple of seconds. Let's go ahead and close the Flash player. Now, as we mentioned earlier, frame labels move with their respective keyframes. So what happens if we decide we want the loop or the start to occur at a later point along the timeline as opposed to frame 1? Let's go down and let's click and select keyframe 1 on the labels layer. Move your mouse pointer over that frame until you see a small box icon that appears in the lower right-hand corner of your pointer. This means that if you click and drag at this point, you can actually relocate this keyframe, and in turn the frame label with it. Let's go ahead, click and drag and pull to the right, and you'll see that the keyframe follows. Let's go ahead and drop this keyframe at frame 20 instead, and release. So now I've moved this keyframe as well as the frame label attached to it to frame 20 on this specific layer. Now what's nice is, since my action script is referring to the frame label and not to a specific frame number, if this is the new starting point at which I want the loop to begin, there's nothing further for me to do. There's no action script for me to adjust. I don't even need to go back and say go to and play 20, because it knows to use the frame label instead of a specific frame number. Let's see how this has affected my animation by once again going up to Control and choosing Test Movie. So we'll see the animation has been modified. When the playhead reaches keyframe 70, it knows to start from wherever it finds a frame label called Start. In this case, that frame label now sits at keyframe 20 as opposed to keyframe 1. So the advantage here is I didn't have to change my action script in order to readjust the animation or the loop. This is especially handy if you have lots of different action scripts controlling the timeline and you continue to evolve your project. As you evolve a project, things may move around, you may add or subtract animation, but as long as you're using frame labels, it has a point of reference that's independent of the actual frame that the animation sits on. Let's go ahead and close our Flash Player. Let's go ahead and assign some additional frame labels that mark some significant points along our timeline. On that same labels layer, go ahead and select frame 70. Use the F6 shortcut key or right-click and choose Insert Keyframe to add a new keyframe at this position. And once again, go up to the Properties panel on the right side of your workspace and locate the Name field underneath the Label category and click inside. Let's go ahead and give this specific frame the label of Middle and hit Enter or Return. Let's go ahead and add one more by scrolling down to the end of the timeline. And go ahead and select frame 130 on that same labels layer. Once again, use the F6 shortcut key and add a new keyframe at this position. And with that keyframe selected, we're going to go back up to the Properties panel and assign this new keyframe the name of End and hit Enter or Return. So now we have three specific frame labels that mark three significant points of our animation: the beginning, or the start, the end, and the midpoint at which the truck could either continue on the track or make the same loop once again. These become especially handy when you need to actually control an animation, because we can send it to any of these respective points regardless of what keyframe or what number keyframe specifically they fall on. Let's scroll back to the beginning of the timeline, and what we're going to do is, just to set this back to the way things should be, we're going to move our start keyframe back to its original position. So go ahead and click on that start keyframe on the labels layer, click and drag and reposition it again at frame 1.